Okay, they call me Diamond Dave, Diamond Dave Whitaker, San Francisco, California. A relic of what generation? The Beat generation. And that kind of puts me forth chronologically to establish my, how did I say it on Facebook? My timeline. To begin that segue from beat to hippie. My definition of hippie, in fact, was beatnik plus LSD equals hippie. Because I was there. I was there at this, what later in hindsight, like so many things in hindsight, began to assume historical significance you didn't realize at the time. And this was called the Gathering of the Tribes, the Human Being. And it was in Golden Gate Park. It was the first free concert in Golden Gate Park. Its date was, I believe, January 14th, 1967. And again, in hindsight, it was really the kickoff. In hindsight, I realized it was the passing of the torch from one generation, the beat generation, to this new generation emerging as yet unnamed, because that happened just a few months later, called the Hippies. And I say beatnik plus LSD equals hippie, because even right there, Osley, who had created and produced some of the best LSD around. Osley Acid was called. Blue Cheer. For the Southland was Orange Sunshine. Blue Cheer, barrels, an incredible variety, and he was there just passing out LSD. And the poster said, Michael McClure, Danny Prima, Ellen Ginsberg were there from the Beat Generation, and some others were there on this day. Ginsberg was playing his little piano, his Indian piano, his harmonium, and Buddhist chanting. And that's where Timothy Leary. That's where Timothy Leary said, got up, he was dressed all in white, and he said, turn on, tune in, drop out. And that was the, and that went around the world. Oh, it was a big scandal. They put him on Time magazine and said the most hated man in America. Supposedly responsible for destroying a whole generation. Just for saying, turn on, tune in, drop out, which you're already doing, of course. And I had gotten used to, I'd come back to San Francisco. I'd spent a couple of years in Israel in a kibbutz. Went back home to Minneapolis for a while. That's where I became Bob Dylan's mentor, not realizing that was happening, but it was definitely happening. He was only 18 years old, just down from Hibbing, Minnesota, where the wind hits heavy in the borderline. I'll get back to that because I want to go on. So that's where the so that was the beginning. We'd been used to. I got back in '65, hitchhiked across the country with the mother of my kids, Ubi. In fact, she was pregnant with Ubi. I had no idea that Ubi's my oldest son. He's a child of the summer of love. If you go to his website, ubi9000.com, you can see him today. He's a fantastic, my kids I'm Native American, Jewish, and Caucasian. They're Afro-American, Native Jewish, and Caucasian. Like I said, anyway, and so I got back to San Francisco, and I'd left Greenwich Village, where I knew like the folkies, and I was around and about like I do. And in Washington Square, and this whole crew of people began to collect together. And they were letting their freak flag fly. They were taking it beyond the beats in a lot of different ways. But just they were letting their hair grow. They weren't cutting their hair. They weren't cutting their beards. They were taking that next level. So I got to San Francisco. Instead of being taken to North Beach, where all the beats hung out, which I remembered, which I thought, I'd been gone for a few years. This is 1960, maybe 65, 66. Instead, Tambu, this 7-foot black Congo drummer, who picked me up, and he brought me to this commune. I hadn't even really heard the review. I come from Israel and the kibbutz, but I stopped in Minneapolis, but really didn't know the word commune yet. In the Haight-Ashbury, and there was just a few handfuls of it, and then we discovered ways. There's all these empty houses, empty flats, because the empty flats, because it was the time of white flight. This is when white people were leaving the neighborhood, black people were moving in, and they were moving out to the suburbs. So there's a lot of empty flats. And we could just move in and take over and stay there for weeks and months. And so all these folks followed me from San Francisco, and all they knew was, I said, you could meet me at Haight-Ashbury. And Haight-Ashbury was a totally white kind of neighborhood, but I'd be there in the corner. And they started showing up and following me there. And so it started so I'd been in the first commune at 10 Page Street. Anyway, it was kind of anyway. And so we'd move in, and they were like squads. We'd move in, and everybody would be filled in, and there'd be stuff happening 24/7, and drugs, and we'd get up every day and go out to what we called Antoine's, which was St. Anthony's Dining Hall. It was across town, you walk it. So this whole troop of people would be trooping, dancing, carrying on, long hair. People never see anything quite like us. What was these? And then as time went on, months when we were just a few months, we began meeting other people who looked a lot like us. And we'd stop and talk and go to lunch together and go by their places. So these different kind of collective households, communes began coming together. 1090 Page Street was one. That's where the bands like Janis Joplin and had come up from Texas. All this happening after the Grateful Dead had just become the Grateful Dead had stopped being the world. And they'd be playing in the basement. So it was the place. And then as time went on, more and more people started showing up in San Francisco. I had heard this place to come, and we're already part as this yet unnamed generation. Later, we could not so much later be called hippies. And people started setting up and getting together, and then there began to be some free shows in the park. Well, the first one was this human being, that my friends, the gathering of the tribes, and this happened really quickly, a gathering of the tribes, but we didn't really realize until we went there to that field in Golden Gate Park, January 14th. It was a beautiful day in San Francisco. There was a couple thousand people there. And we had no idea that there were so many people. Wow, what's going on? And Owsley passing out acid. And Ken Kesey, in fact, I was outside my house down in Fillmore with my kid, Ubi, who is a child now, and his bus pulls up. And you get in, we're going to the Human Being. So I hopped in, and we rode up there and pulled the bus up there, and that was the Human Being. And it also said on the poster, all San Francisco bands. Not some, not this. So there they were, Quicksilver Messenger Service. I'm not sure Janis had gotten there. Canned Heat, the Grateful Dead just becoming, and all coming. So it was this big event. This airplane went over, and this guy jumped out with a rainbow parachute and throwing down joints. I mean, it'd be happening. And then later came the acid test. I think it was after the acid test, the first acid test, Kesey, with the same bands playing, and garbage cans filled with Electric Kool-Aid. So really, it was really happening. We were into it. It was like the beginning of what wait, how many years down the line? Close to half a century down the line.
So what was the acid test?
The acid test was just a bunch of bands playing and people in costume. And for the first time, I saw a strobe light going around and this garbage can filled with Electric Kool-Aid. Can you pass the acid test? Can you take a bunch of this Electric Kool-Aid and just keep on dancing? Keep it reasonably in command of some of your senses. That was the acid test. And
did you pass?
I guess so. I'm sitting here. I passed on and on. Well, eventually I realized that that I had reached the point of diminishing returns, that I was already rewired. This is 67, going into 67, going into that summer. And so the Diggers. Have you heard of the Diggers? So we got together when this song came out. We're talking about the early days in the Haight and how it became the Summer of Love emerged. And so the song went around, went on the bestseller. The Beatles are playing everywhere. The English thing is happening. So there's this explosion, but it still hadn't reached. Then this guy came out with a song that went nationwide. Come to San Francisco and wear some flowers in your hair. Have you ever heard that?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, Scott McKenzie, was it? come to San Francisco. And we were there. We said, my God, we had a few communes then. We call them communes, kind of a network of autonomous communes. And we call them communes. And there was this group that came out of the mime troupe. They weren't satisfied. The mime troupe was this Marxist, kind of Marxist, they called mime, but they talked, Marxist street group. And they'd play in the parks. A guy named R.G. Davis, who was a Brechtian, a follower of Brecht, he's a Marxist, led that. Ran it with kind of an iron hand. And the park, and they were putting forth a Brechtian kind of message. And there was a small group said, we want to get out. This is too confined, and got out. And and so the question became, all these people are coming to San Francisco. Who's going to feed them? Where are they going to be staying? So we constituted ourselves as the Diggers. And the Diggers goes back to the 17th century. It was a radical, ultra-radical Protestant, believed that Jesus was a revolutionary. And they used to dig under the fences. The greens had been, by the aristocracy had fenced off the greens. And they dug underneath and planted gardens there. They're the Diggers. If you can find the Diggers song by Chumbawamba, that's the song from the time. The guy wrote it. They were crushed, of course.
That song is about that?
It's the Diggers song?
Chumbawamba?
The Chumbawamba does. Yeah, it's about the Diggers. And go ahead, we are the Diggers. Listen to it. 17th century. It was written by a guy named Winsley, something Winsley, who was like their leader. They were like the most radical. They were the levelers, the most radical kind of the Christian Reformation. They were in total revolt. So if you're going to follow Jesus, you got to follow Jesus. Anyway, and so we called ourselves the Diggers. But that was also a play on words because they were digging it. And if you look up thediggers.org, you can see our manifestos, few manifestos of the time, and catch a bit of that flavor. So we're the first ones to start feeding people every day in the Panhandle. And then we found all these empty buildings I was talking about, empty flats and so on, and they became, then the word became crash pads, where people would come in, they'd come on Haight Street, what do I do now? And they'd come to our free store. We started the first free store. This is called the Free Frame of Reference. And somebody built this big picture frame, about as big as this one. And you'd step through the picture frame to come into the free store, the free frame of reference. And then all these people were told, put some flowers in your yard, come to San Francisco. This is where they could come, and it was a frame of reference. Because they thought San Francisco was California, that you could walk around in T-shirts. They do nothing. Walk around in T-shirts and cutouts or whatever, and you're fine. And here it is, San Francisco, a town of which Mark Twain said the coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco. So anyway, so we had the free store. It was like this. It was like the word had gotten around. It was kind of like a disaster thing, where all these people would bring about all this stuff, all this amazing stuff. So we had our free store. This is a free store right out here, right out the door. To quote Rage Against the Machine, it's happening here. Where's it happening? Right outside the door. We had the free store. And there's also the first underground press called the Communication Company, because we had two mimeograph machines cranking it out, and anybody could bring in anything, and we'd type it up and print it up, and we'd put it out on the street. By this time, the street was so packed with people. I'm compressing time, but it happened awfully fast. And so we had the Communication Company. In fact, here's a poem. There's a poem called the 30th, I was asked to write this. Since Diamond Dave, since you're a poet and you turned 30, I turned 30 on that street, that some called Love and some called Hate Street. At the end of that summer, they call the Summer of Love, Scorpio. Here's the poem. Let's see. Almost 30th anniversary Summer of Love. That's 1997. Almost solstice. Here at the end of Haight, where the park begins. 3 decades down the line. Food Not Bombs. Diggers of today, serving bacon soup and Katz's Dale's bagels, saying get in the loop and have some soup. No time to frown. Wait, let me try again. It's been a while. 30th anniversary Summer of Love. almost solstice. Another Monday, here at the end of Haight, where the park begins, 3 decades down the line, gathering around. Small-time drug dealers, hangers in and hangers out, Golden Gate campers, Golden Gate Park campers, undercover cops. Food Not Bombs, diggers today, serving bacon soup and Katz's day-old bagels, saying get in the loop and have some soup. No time to frown, it's time to chow down. Gathering around, gnarly old hippies, veterans of a half-forgotten war, the Wrecking Crew, Fast Eddie's posse, deadhead refugees, dreadlock street survivors, and gaggles of gutter punks just off the trains, the freight trains. Tie-dyed wafer and backpackers heading for Oregon, the Rainbow Gathering, those for whom 1997 is their 1967. Ladle in hand, my mind's eye dances down the ribbon of time to that summer of love, to that summer of bud. Serving free food to draft dodgers, AWOLs fleeing the war, long-haired urban guerrillas. Come who may. The Free Frame of Reference, the communication company seeds the underground press, and no joke, lots of good smoke, and the digger slogan, 1% free, returns to the community. Screaming awake from the American dream, 4 generations, beatniks, hippies, punks, hip-hoppers, rastas, freewheeling, freestyling, and out here in the cutting edge, freewheeling, freestyling, and free-flowing, out here in the cutting edge of social change. Well, the family dogs back at the beach, October 12th, soccer fields, big bands, big names, big deal, but don't forget that 1% free. I mentioned the diggers, I mentioned the communication company before, I mentioned the Free Frame of Reference, but the family dog was Chet Helms Collective, where all the early bands played. And it was the last place before I went belly up, after the death of the hippie and so on, was out at the beach, at the playland of the beach. And the 30th anniversary was at the soccer fields right across the road, where we had Occupy and had a reservation, and without any papers, just before I left, with no permits, but we got a permit, our First Amendment of the Constitution, to guarantee our right to speak freely, follow what a religious practice is ours, and assemble, and we're doing that. And so we had a show there, out there in the very same place as the 30th anniversary, Summer of Love, at the soccer fields, just before I left. And we started a garden there, the sustainable working group of Occupy was there, we made it going on, but it was right there. And since I was at the first human being, January 14th, 1967, and be there with all my brothers and sisters of Occupy. And we had tents. We never had tents. It was a set. We had tents there. We had our free kitchen, which we didn't have back then. The diggers were really the first to realize that feeding people is what it's about, and that the food's out there, in the Panhandle every day. And the digger papers, check it out, and you can see our manifesto. You see where we're coming from, and you'll see a lot of commonality between what was happening then and now. And what was the other? Oh, the 1% free was a digger slogan. 1% free, and that these new hippie capitalists should kick back at least 1% to the community, was the idea. But it also stood. Well, here's the maestro here. Good. No, I wasn't going to say. Take over. Here's a man way more eloquent than I am. Way funnier than I am. Way cool. What? I know. But anyway, that's the guy we were talking about. I'm just laying the context. I'm going back to that summer, they call it Summer of Love, 1967. And context is everything, they say, in certain circles. So I was just laying the context, but besides, I'm blabbing on. So anyway, so in the 70s, so then we had the death of the hippie, because we realized
Tell them about the time you and the Beatles broke out John Sinclair out of prison.